My name is Logan. I am a GRE instructor with Manhattan Prep, and this is part of a series that we've been doing with GRE Club over the last couple of months to cover in hour-long sessions all of the main content for the GRE. So this is number 10 out of 12, and there's 2 more after this week. This is our final, I believe, verbal session of the series. We're going to be talking about how to get to 160 plus, how to sort of jump past a plateau if you've gotten stuck a little bit on verbal. Before I get into all that, if you want to go back and watch any of the previous episodes in the series, you should be able to find them, the links in the description to this video. So we've had lots of quant videos. We've had videos on verbal about both reading comprehension and vocab. And now we're kind of doing this summary verbal session where I'll be focusing on what tips I usually share with students who have been studying for a while. They've learned the basics and they're trying to figure out, okay, how do I put all my resources at my disposal to improve and get to that final score that I want to get to? And I think this is an interesting question with verbal in particular, because verbal is sort of a totally different ballgame than quant in terms of how the studying and learning progression often goes. So if you're here live, I can see your comments. So if you have any comments or questions for me as we're going, I'll try to keep track of them as best I can and respond to them as they come in. If you're watching later, there's still comments to share your questions, and we can try to get back to you there. Thanks for being here. So as we talk about getting to 160 plus, first I want to say why that number. So I'll go back to cover some of the basics of how verbal and quant really work on this exam. So you may have seen bits of this in some of the previous sessions in the series if you've been watching them all. But for verbal specifically, I don't think we dove into all of this. So the scale is from 130 to 170 of grading the GRE. And you also have 2 sections that feed into that score. There's adaptive scoring. So with verbal, you're going to have 1 verbal section. The test is going to sort of react to you and decide how difficult of a section to show you in section 2. Your section 2 might look quite different from someone else's. The same thing is happening with quant. I'm just not going to focus on that today, where it's measuring you during the first section, and then they're going to adapt to you in the second section. The better you do, the harder the test is going to get. They are trying to calibrate and give you a second section that best fits your skill level. So if you do really well at the beginning, they're going to show you a very difficult second section. If you struggle in the first section, they're going to give you an easier second section. But getting a difficult second section is a good thing. The more difficult of a section you get, the higher the ceiling is and the floor is of your score. So getting into the technicalities of how the score works, it's kind of like this. Imagine the final range from 130 to 170. Your first section of verbal is going to have hard questions, easy questions, medium questions, all types of questions. Then you're going to split into multiple different paths. On our practice tests and how we believe the real test works as well is that there's 3 main sections you get in section 2. You might get the harder one, the more medium one, or the easy one. In the hard section, what happens is there is no easy questions anymore. It's all sort of hard and medium questions. The very easy questions have been removed. In the easy second section, what happens is there's no more of the very hard questions. So all your questions are a little more easy or medium. If you get a medium second section, the difficulty is ultimately sort of the same as the first one, approximately, and you'll have a range of easy, medium, and hard questions. And then your final score is sort of tiered out with a big influence of which section you got into. So if you are in the hard second section, your final score is probably going to be in that 160s range, maybe from like the high 150s at the very low end up to 170 at the very high end. If you're in a more average second section, you are going to be getting, probably in that 150s, mid to high 150s range, most likely. And if you're in an easier second section, that's where you might be in the low 150s and below. Even though 150 is exactly the middle of this range, the median score is a little bit above 150. So the most typical place of like an average GRE student is maybe in the low to middle 150s. So there's a few reasons why 160 is this magic number that students are often trying to get to on both verbal and quant. As an instructor, the most common thing I hear from students is that they're trying to get a 160 verbal, 160 quant. Higher than that is great too, of course. So sometimes I hear people who want to get 165 on both sections, or who want to get a 330 overall, which I know we had a video on earlier in this series talking about how to get to 330, which is an average of 165. But 160 is the most common thing I hear for a couple of reasons. One, I think, is that a lot of schools will say that's what they're looking for. 160 is kind of the cutoff where you can say you're definitely like above average in both sections if you're hitting 160 in both sections. Also, 160 is around the threshold of the harder section. So I think a lot of people get a bit stuck, you might say, or see their score level out in the middle to high 150s because they're having trouble adapting to that hard second section. Or I should say they're either having difficulty getting into the hard second section, so they're not quite good enough at the first section to get into the harder one, or they're getting into the harder one but struggling with it because of the higher difficulty. And so their score is staying near the lower end of the hard section range. So what I'm going to talk about today is what can you do to really raise your skills across the board so that you are getting, I'm not going to talk that much today about specific skills. I'm going to be talking about things you can do to raise your ability across the board in verbal to improve your ability to get into this harder section or improve your ability to do well in this harder section. And the biggest theme, and what we're going to spend the most of time on this afternoon, at least this afternoon here where I am in New York City, is reviewing your mistakes. And I want to talk, before I even move on to a specific problem that we're going to do as an example, I want to talk about this idea of reviewing your mistakes and keeping a review log. So we tell a lot of our students that reviewing and keeping a review log is one of the most important things you can do to really make sure that you are improving on the exam. And I actually think this is maybe more important in verbal than in quant. Let me explain what I mean. In quant, there are so many skills to learn. You can learn the formulas for geometry. You can learn the process for quadratic equations. You can really get a lot of repetitions of doing the same skill over and over and really learn things that you didn't know before, and then deploy those things when you see them on the exam. So you can improve quite a lot in math by practicing the skills without really doing full final GRE problems. It's necessary to do full GRE problems, of course, to practice deploying those skills, but I think a lot of people improve most in math from just practicing the skills themselves, practicing your algebra, practicing your fractions, practicing your percents to make sure that you're not making math mistakes on the exam. There's not really an equivalent to that on the verbal section. You don't have like a list of subjects to learn in verbal. Every passage, every question is on a brand new subject. So it comes down to mastering the different types of question formats. And it comes down to really knowing how to handle the traps in the questions themselves. So I think in verbal, it's more important to just keep doing more full-scale problems, official problems when you can. And it's even more important than in quant to review your mistakes and really ask yourself, why did I make that mistake? Why did I get that wrong? I'm going to go through a guide of how I like to do this. And we're going to imagine that you just did this question. My circle seems to be a little bit misplaced here, but Don't worry about reading this passage yet. I'm going to give you a chance to read it in a moment. But let's just say this is a verbal question you have seen on an exam, and it's time to review. You got it wrong. You picked A. The real answer was B. And for the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to say that you had eliminated C, D, and E quite easily, which is correct. It was not C, D, or E. A and B were the two you were considering, and you chose A. It turns out that was wrong. It was really B. This is going to happen quite a lot on the GRE because in many verbal questions, especially reading comprehension, there's 2 or even 3 wrong answers that are pretty easy to eliminate if you understood the passage. And then there's 2 answers that both are very tempting. A lot of times in verbal, you're going to be making kind of like a 50-50 call of like, oh, I can't quite tell if it's that or that. Sometimes you're going to get it right. Sometimes you're going to get it wrong. What we're going to simulate here is you reached one of those 50-50 calls. You got it wrong. What do you do next? How do you review your work? Because I think this is where you are really going to unlock your better ability to answer similar types of questions in the future. And these are the 2 questions I want you to be asking yourself when you are in this situation. They're very simple questions. Why was the correct answer correct? And why was the incorrect answer that you chose not correct? This 2-pronged approach is another thing that's different in verbal than in most quant questions. Most quant questions, you do your calculations, you get your answer, you put it in, and you leave. Your answer is right if you did everything right. It's wrong if you misunderstood the question somehow, or you made a math mistake along the way. You don't, as many times in math, have this situation where you're really stuck between 2 answers and you decide to go with one. Because usually your own work led you to one answer, and if it didn't, you just leave a guess. In verbal, you're doing this over and over. You're stuck between 2, and you decide between one, like a judge. You deem which one is better and which one is worse. When you make a mistake, there's always something you missed in the correct answer that could have told you that it was correct. And there's something that you saw in the wrong answer that you liked, but it wasn't really right. So there's something you missed in the right answer that made it right, and there's something you missed in the wrong answer that made it wrong. And what I want you to do when you make one of these errors is really dive in and try to understand what were those things on both sides. So we're going to practice that with this question. And this is not an easy question, by the way. This is a difficult passage and a somewhat difficult question. I've already told you what answer you chose in theory, but I want you to take a couple minutes. If you are live, you can do this now. If you're watching on YouTube later, sorry, you can skip ahead a minute or 2 and find where I dive into this. But just read this passage and think about think about the 2 things that I said. Why is A wrong, and why is B right? Now, I'm going to preface my diving into this problem by again reiterating that this is a difficult passage. So I use this one because the more difficult the passage, the more likely you're going to make these types of mistakes that you have to diagnose. If you're here live, I'm going to go ahead. Sorry if you are still reading. Of course, if you're watching later, just go ahead and pause until you get your own chance to read through this and think about what your, why do you think B is the answer over A? I'm going to first speak a bit about why is this a hard passage and problem? Because one of the skills that will help you is actually being able to diagnose when a problem is hard so that you can preempt it taking up too much of your time or stressing you out too much. There's going to be hard problems. So when you see a hard problem, I try to tell myself, okay, don't get stressed out. I already knew there was going to be hard problems. Here it is. It's expected. Why is this one hard? The vocabulary in this question, in this passage, I should say, is quite advanced. I see words like heterogeneous. I see words like what other words are in here? Recalcitrant. These are words that I certainly don't use every day, especially recalcitrant, and there's a couple others in the passage. Difficult vocab words, we think about them mainly in vocab questions, but in reading comprehension, they can really mess us up as well. It's why learning vocab is so helpful, and it's something we'll talk about in the second half of this session. This is also just a very complicatedly written passage. The GRE is not always full of the most beautiful writing you've ever seen. We have lots of sort of doubling back, saying things like we start with a however, a granted, need not. This is not because. So many parts of this passage are contradicting themselves or are having double negatives. It's kind of spending a lot of words to say what it's trying to say. So just the vocabulary and density of this passage makes it something to be aware of. If I saw this passage on my exam, I might consider coming back and doing it at the end of my verbal section. But okay, for now, I want to go back and talk about actually answering this question. So I'll dive into how I would break this down. And maybe you got there already on your own. Maybe you did not. This passage overall, if I was summarizing it, it's saying that this novel, Wuthering Heights, is complicated. It has many different interpretations, and it's hard to interpret all of it in one consistent way. That's what all these words are trying to say. I'm going to look for parts of the passage that address these 2 points. So I'm going to look for evidence that relates to A and B. The question is asking, what would the author agree to? So remember, on most verbal passages, you want to be able to literally point to the evidence in the passage and relate it to the answer choice. I'm going to use this word, heterogeneous, to easily find some content in the passage that relates to A. Would the author agree that interpretations of a novel should not try to unite heterogeneous elements? This says that granted the presence of some elements doesn't argue for an authorial awareness of novelistic construction comparable to that of Henry James. Okay, I'm going to kind of ignore the Henry James part. It says that certain elements do encourage attempts to unify the novel's heterogeneous parts. What's heterogeneous, by the way? It means like varied. Homogeneous would mean all the same. Heterogeneous means varied or various. Any interpretation that seeks to unify all of the novel's diverse elements is bound to be somewhat unconvincing. So what this is saying is that if you try to unify the diverse elements, it's going to be somewhat unconvincing. This does sound like good evidence for A, I think. It's saying if you try to put together all the different parts of Wuthering Heights, it's going to be unconvincing if you try to make one unified theory. That is very similar to what A is saying. But I know that A is wrong. B is right. So let's try to find the evidence for B and really ask myself, why is B better? I found the evidence here by looking for things similar to being heterogeneous. Now I'm going to look for things similar to being inflexible. And I see it here. Rigidity is kind of the opposite of being flexible. So being rigid and being inflexible are similar. Rigidity in any interpretation of this or any novel is always a danger. That does sound a lot like B. Don't be inflexible, because rigidity in interpretation is always a danger. This is the situation you're going to be in a lot, that coin flip I was talking about. There's a part of the passage that makes you like A. There's a part of the passage that makes you like B. Why is B the better one? There's two reasons in this case. The first, and I'm going to focus on this one because it's the one that is the most repeatable into other passages, is that you always want stronger evidence. This is something I spoke about a bit when I led one of our reading comprehension sessions. You want strong evidence and a mild answer. So the job is that your evidence needs to prove the answer. In order to do that, you want the evidence to be strong and the answer itself to be mild. You don't want the answer to be stronger and the evidence to be milder, because then it's harder to prove, it's harder to reach what the evidence is trying to say. Well, let's see, why might the evidence for B be stronger and the answer milder? One of them is this, looking at the evidence first. Always a danger, I would say is stronger evidence if I compare it to somewhat unconvincing. If I'm saying, okay, both of these evidence are saying, hey, try not to unite heterogeneous elements, try not to be inflexible. This one says it's going to be somewhat unconvincing. This one says it's always a danger. Always is stronger than somewhat, and a danger is a stronger term than being unconvincing. So I'm going to say that we have stronger evidence related to B. If we look at the answer, we want the answer to be mild relative to the evidence. Sorry that it keeps switching. If I look at these two answers, well, B says don't be inflexible, whereas A says don't try. I personally would say that not trying is a more severe statement than not being inflexible. If someone told me not to be inflexible as I was doing something, I would think, okay, well, there's a lot of ways I could do it. I'll try to be flexible and have a approach that responds to the situation. That doesn't sound like such a severe statement telling me not to be inflexible. Not trying, if someone told me not to try, that's kind of cut and dry. That's a very strong statement. So our answer is stronger in A, milder in B, and we want the answer to be milder. So B wins by having stronger evidence. B wins by having a milder answer. This is very repeatable in other verbal passages. When you get one of these coin flips wrong, is go and see which one had stronger evidence and why. You'll probably find that the correct one had slightly stronger evidence somehow, or that it was maybe like maybe the correct one was a milder answer that was easier to prove in the from the beginning. There's a second reason that B is actually better here, and it has to do with a often forgotten part of a verbal question, which is the question itself. So this is another tip when you miss a question, and this is really true in quant and verbal. A lot of times when we miss a question, we focus on the answer. Why wasn't that answer right? Sometimes you need to look back at the question and see if you understood the question correctly. There's one little tiny bit of this question that steers us towards B as well, and that is this. It's asking for the interpretation of a novel in general. If we look at these two pieces of evidence that I compared, this bit, any novel, helps B as well. Because it shows that this statement, when the author made it, they were thinking about novels in general as a whole. If we go back to the blue evidence that was for A, it's talking about the novel. It's talking about Wuthering Heights, the specific novel that this passage is focused on. And this blue evidence that I highlighted, it relates to A. It's not, what A said is not even quite wrong as it relates to, what this passage says. But it's not as strong as B. And it doesn't answer the specific question as well as B does because of this difference between this novel specifically and this doing what we want, focusing on any novel. This coin flip that we've been talking about, I think that improving your verbal can really lean on this work of anytime you got a verbal question wrong, go in there, analyze why was the right one. What did I miss about the right answer that I should have caught? What was wrong about the wrong answer that I fell for so that I can avoid falling for that again? And you do that by looking into these things. How strong was the evidence? How supportable was the answer? And how much did it relate to the question itself? All of this is kind of separate from actually the act of reading the passage. It's about the decision-making process you used. If I was keeping a review log and writing my notes, the way I might write out my process from this question would be this. Why was the correct answer correct? Well, the evidence was stronger and the choice was milder. Plus, it better related to the question's phrasing about novels in general. Why was the one that I chose, why was A not right? Well, it's the same two things, but kind of inverted. It was a weaker evidence, a stronger answer, which I don't want. And it was a little bit less related to the question itself. You can do this same process or a similar one on vocab. I'm not going to go through a vocab example in as much detail, but if you take a text completion or a sentence equivalence question, these two meta questions for you to ask yourself still work really well. In a vocab question, you chose B, it was really C. Go in there, ask yourself, well, not just why was C right? Figure out why was C right? Where was the evidence in the sentence that supported the vocab word C being chosen? and look at B, which you chose. Look back at the sentence and figure out, well, why does B not fit? Doing both of these things helps because it helps you sense what you're basically doing is rewiring your own decision-making process so that the next time you come to a question that hinges on a similar element, you'll be better prepared to sense. You'll have like better spidey senses basically for when the correct answer is calling to you, and better sort of senses to avoid the right answers. So write this stuff down. I think this is something that I tell students to do all the time, and most students don't. If you do, you will be improving your chances of success. I promise you that. It's a lot of work. It might feel like a hassle. It might take time, but it is, how you really condense your thinking and make it a little more tangible so that you can learn from it. If you do your review more hastily, then you are leaving yourself very susceptible to making the same mistake again. The goal of review log is systematically reduce the amount of mistakes you're making. I'm going to skip ahead to the other biggest topic, really, which is growing your vocabulary. So everything I just talked about is kind of on the back end, or it's late in the process, by which I mean you do this when you're on a real GRE question. You do this when you're taking the exam, that decision-making process we just walked through. What can you do now every day? Oh, excuse me for that sneeze. What can you do at the beginning of the process to raise your skill level? That first half is kind of about like making the best decisions you can on testing. Growing your vocabulary is the best thing available to you on verbal that really does raise your skill level behind the scenes. So this is the only thing in verbal that's quite similar to practicing your geometry formulas over and over, practicing your algebra equation solving skills over and over. And I watched the session that we gave in this series about vocabulary questions. I'm not going to focus that much right now on answering vocabulary questions on the exam, but I'm going to talk about how to just learn vocab, how to build your vocabulary, the basics of it. One thing that Chris, my colleague, suggested in that lesson that I really back up, that I really agree with, is it's great to make your own flashcards and to make them from official materials. So you'll find online a lot of GRE vocab lists. Manhattan Prep has them. Any GRE website you look at is likely to have a vocabulary list. Those are fine. There's nothing wrong with using those lists to practice with. But the best thing that you can practice with is go into the GRE official guide or other official materials, make your own flashcards from the words you don't know. Because that way you know for sure this is a word that the GRE likes to use because it's in their content. And making your own flashcards is very helpful because of the work you put in. It is more work, but the work you put into writing it down physically, the work you put into thinking up a sample sentence to use, a sample story to use, a little memory rhyme or something to understand the word, that is what makes it stick. Just looking at a flashcard, that helps some, but the labor that goes into creating your own makes it much, much more memorable for yourself. So this way you know your words are words that are going to be valuable to learn, and you know that you're going to hold on to them more consistently if you make your own flashcards from official materials. So go through whenever you encounter a word you don't know, make a card. Or put it on a list. You know, if it's not literally a card that you flip over, it could just be a list that you're keeping in a notebook. This way, you're basically getting the most bang for your buck for your vocabulary time. Vocabulary also does take a while to learn. You know, if you've learned another language besides your native language, you know that learning language takes a lot of repetitions and it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of immersion. So you have to be really practicing it every day. And that relates to this question of like how to study vocab in your schedule. Like all the other things I'm saying not to do, this is still okay if you study 5 hours on one day. It's better than nothing, a lot better than nothing. But this is what you really want. Vocab or not, it's best to revisit the content a lot. There's a concept in learning science called spaced repetition. This is a very central concept in how our brains learn things, is we need to revisit the same thing several times before we really know. Our brain does better at locking in information if we have to see it over and over, as opposed to if we see it once, lots in a row. So as soon as you stop learning, you start forgetting. Now imagine you studied here and you got your content really high and you just forget, and you're just like forgetting constantly. What this does is you forget a little bit, but then you build it up, and then you forget a little bit, but then you build it up, but then you forget a little bit, and then you build it up. And it helps your level actually increase because you're interrupting the forgetting process by bringing the content back. So it's very hard to do. I personally struggle with this. I am a big time crammer. I'm likely to do anything I got to do in one big chunk, close to the last minute. So I understand if this is where you are and if this is what happens to you. But it is so true that this is the process that like leads to greatness, you could say, of doing, visiting the same topic, the same content over and over. That's why us GRE teachers that are able to sit down and very consistently get a very high score, it's not because we studied everything we need to know once and then stopped doing it. If I had taken the GRE, 1 or 2 times and then not taken it ever since I had started this job, for example, my skills would have gotten worse. But because we all take the test like somewhat frequently and also teach it, more frequently than that, we keep our skills up by revisiting them. And the same thing can happen to you on a different scale when you are learning vocabulary for the first time. Okay. A little bit more about how to actually spend your vocabulary studying time and how to use spaced repetition. Make your flashcards and then keep reviewing the same cards for several weeks. These stars, I want you to imagine the stars are like the times that you're looking back at the same flashcard. You make it, and then maybe you look at it the next day. Then you're like, okay, I kind of know this one. And you look back at it like in 3 days. Then you're like, okay, let's say you got this one wrong. You visit it again in a couple days. But now you've known it really confidently, and you can start taking longer and longer breaks between reviewing the same thing. You can build this system into your own practice by using 3 different decks or more than 3 decks of flashcards. This is called a Lightner system, by the way. Let me make sure I'm saying that right. If you want to Google this process, there is something called the Lightner system, Leitner. There's a few good YouTube videos specifically about this and websites specifically about this, getting into much more detail about how to use a Lightner box method for learning formulas or flashcards. And it's very helpful because it sort of forces the cards to come back to you at opportune moments. And what you do is you make your cards. At the beginning, you quiz each card daily. Once you are getting the same card right, so you know the word a couple times in a row when you quiz yourself on it, it basically gets a promotion to the next level box. And this is the getting it box, or you can call it whatever you want, but it's the box where it's not fresh knowledge anymore. You know it. Here you're quizzing a little less often, maybe twice a week, for example. If you keep getting it right a couple more times, it keeps going to the got it box. This is where you're not ready to totally stop practicing this word, but you know it. Thumbs up when you see it, you know what it means. If you keep getting it right, even when it's there, it gets promoted like out of the system. You don't need to learn it anymore because it is learned. But at any point, if you get a word wrong, it gets demoted down to the just made box where it is hanging out with the other new words that you have made. So to do this best, you're also making new flashcards or somehow introducing new words consistently as you go. This process will definitely help you learn these words. It does take time. It is time that can feel frustrating because it's perhaps a bit more tedious than doing practice tests or things like that, but it is rewarding, and it feels good to learn new words, and it will help you quite a bit on the exam because the vocabulary words are not just the answer choices in the vocabulary questions. They are words inside of the fill-in-the-blank sentences for text completion and sentence equivalence. They are words inside of the reading passages. They are words inside of the reading passage answers. It lifts your skill level across the board if you know more words, and especially if you know more words that the GRE likes to use. When I first started teaching the GRE, I didn't realize how important it was for people to learn vocabulary. And part of that is because the prevalence of very hard words on the GRE is not always so high. I've noticed that words that are like extremely rare don't show up very often. If they do, a lot of times it's like several extremely rare words on one problem where they're really trying to get you or see if you know your really advanced stuff. But words that are somewhat rare, sort of medium-high difficulty level vocab words, I've realized over time, they show up everywhere, every passage, every sentence, every list of answer choices. And so you need to collect as many of those as you can so that you're ready for them when you see them. Here are some ideas of where you can learn vocab outside of official materials. Remember that official materials are best, but here's some other things. And then I'll get to your question, a couple questions that I see in the chat. First, on YouTube, we have on Manhattan Prep a GRE Word of the Day playlist, actually a couple of playlists over on our YouTube channel, which I really like these for putting on in the background, learning some words. I think it's a fun series. I'm in the series, so I'm biased, but I think this is a fun place to learn vocab. These are some apps that let you make your own flashcards inside of the app, and some of them even have built-in systems that basically show you the words in a system that lines up with the method I just spoke about, which is I'll spell it out here. It's called a Lightner system or a Lightner box vocabulary learning strategy. You can buy flashcards that are like physical flashcards. That's fine. Again, I recommend making them over this, but there are flashcards out there for Manhattan Prep and other places if you want to do that. And this is one I want to focus on. If you are struggling with vocab and generally struggling with understanding reading passages on the GRE, increasing the amount that you read from the types of English language materials that are used on the test will really help you. This is just 3 examples of like magazines that the GRE takes their passages from. GRE passages are not written from scratch by the GRE. They are typically adopted from other materials, changed a bit to match what they want the passage to be, but they are taken from real-world resources from places just like these or from any newspaper. If you read these sort of magazines, Scientific American, The New Yorker, The Economist, you will be getting yourself adapted to the type of reading that you have to do on the GRE. And you can even focus in, like if you really struggle with science passages on the GRE, you can try to read more science content out in the real world. If you really struggle with culture, arts and culture passages, you can try to read a more like culture-focused publication out in the real world. And it seems a little silly, and it's maybe not what you want to be spending your free time doing, but if you take a few minutes to read an article from any of these sources, even just a couple times a week, you're going to be helping yourself out for adapting to GRE reading and vocab. The question I got in the chat, well, there's a couple of questions. One I got at the beginning, so thanks for your patience, and one I just got. Let me talk about these before I move on to sort of the final stage of my presentation today. A question that came in near the beginning of the session. Sometimes I struggle to understand easy words, but that one word is the only key to the answer because when you Google it, it becomes easy. Yes, that is why learning vocab is so important, and it's kind of what I was just saying of why I've the longer I've taught the GRE, the more I've been emphasizing that learning vocab really is critical for someone who wants to focus on their verbal score. It's because, again, it's not that you're going to see a ton of extremely rare English words, but it's that if you see a word if you do see a word you don't know, it becomes very, very difficult to answer the question. It's kind of mission critical. And for me, still, if I get a verbal question wrong, it is often because I didn't know a word. Doesn't happen that often, but when it does happen, that's the reason. So learning words will help you like prevent that that moment, because your brain will become the Google where when you Google it, it becomes easy. If you knew the word, it was easy. So using these resources, using this process to increase your vocabulary will really help out with that situation. And then there was another question that says, when it comes to reading comprehension, I try eliminating options, but still struggle when two are quite similar and can't differentiate the trap between them. So that takes me back to sort of the example that I gave here. I know me modeling it for you is not the same as you doing it. But this process, fixing or correcting the coin flip, I would say is something to emphasize. Whenever you are looking back and trying to understand an answer, see what the explanation says, if you have an explanation, and learn from that explanation, oh, that's why, that was the difference. This one that I did, this is a very subtle difference between these two answers. You're going to see this a lot. And it's okay. You're going to make the wrong choice in the coin flip sometimes. Your goal by reviewing these with such focus is moving it so that instead of a 50% coin flip, you're going to choose the correct one maybe 60% of the time, maybe 70% of the time, maybe 75% of the time. And by doing that, you're getting yourself a couple of more points on the exam. This is one more comment before I talk about one last sort of full topic, and that is that official materials from the GRE, or the ETS, which is the company that produces the GRE, they really are the best for verbal. You'll see a lot of people say this online, and I agree. Even though Manhattan Prep and other test prep companies create our own verbal content as well, that stuff is good. It's not worth, I mean, it is worth practicing with. So you shouldn't disregard it completely. But For verbal more so than quant, I would really focus on official materials, largely because of that vocab bit. It assures you that any words you see are words that the GRE likes to use. So to do that, you have a few options. There is the GRE official guide. This is the textbook that the GRE produces. They released a new one recently. And yes, the ETS big book. I'm not actually that familiar with the big book. So I'm not sure about that, but I will say that these resources are good. The official guide Verbal Reasoning Supplement. This book is older, but don't disregard it. If you look up GRE Verbal Reasoning Supplement, this is sort of a smaller book that is all verbal practice. If you're focusing on improving your verbal, you can buy this book online. It's a really good resource to get a lot more official verbal content than what's in the regular textbook. And then the online practice tests. It's a little hard to find, but there are 2 free practice tests available on the GRE website that you can take. I will say this for verbal. These free ones don't have explanations for the problems. So if you are really trying to learn how the GRE decides what answer is right and what answer is wrong, and you really want to read more official verbal explanations from the GRE, these resources are best. And if you want, there are paid versions of these practice tests online as well that let you see the answer explanations when you are done. So that's an option. I'm sorry that I don't have a great answer for you about the big book. If you meant this book, yes, generally the ETS materials are very accurate to the current exam, unless it's old. If it's more than like 15 years old, then no, which maybe that's what the big book is, and that's why I'm less familiar with it. But any currently published materials here by the ETS are going to be helpful. Okay, there's one last sort of like final tip I was going to say, and this is mastering the format. This is something that I think people sometimes overlook until they get closer to test day. All I mean by that is being very familiar on verbal and quant. Today I'm going to talk about verbal with the question order. I showed this in one of my previous verbal sessions. To reiterate one thing, it's not always exactly the same, but it is generally going to be this. Section 1, 12 problems, 18 minutes. That part is exactly the same. What's generally the case is text completion first, so a few vocab ones with 1 answer choice per blank. Then a little bit of reading comp, probably 1 passage. Then sentence equivalence, then reading comp. Is that comment, yes, it's true, regarding the ETS big book and the age of it, or are you referring to what I've got on the screen right now? I'm not sure. I'll come back to that though. This rhythm, text completion, then reading comp, then sentence equivalence, then reading comp. This is worth knowing, and it's worth experimenting with, I believe. I've had a lot of students in the past who are interested in doing all the vocab first or all the vocab last. I don't have a completely firm recommendation on what's best, because I think it depends on the person. But I will say, if you're intrigued by that, it's worth experimenting with. And I would prefer to say do all the text completion and sentence equivalence first rather than last. These are the quicker problems because the passages are so much shorter. These are about 1 minute each. Whereas all the reading comp, if you factor in all the reading you have to do, they're more like 2 minutes each. So what I like as a rhythm through your verbal section is to do the text completion, kind of skip past this tiny reading comprehension bubble, do the sentence equivalents, mark for review, and any questions that you want to come back to, and then do all the reading comprehension after that. So I would say that's worth trying in one of your practice tests. Do text completion, then sentence equivalents, mark for review any that you want to go back to, then do all the reading comprehension. This is not what everyone should do, so I'm not necessarily saying that everyone should do this, but I think that it is worth trying for some people, especially because reading comprehension just takes longer. Sometimes if you fall behind on a reading comprehension, it can create more rush and more stress that can have negative consequences for the second half of a section. What this does, I'll write it out here a little more clearly. If you do all TC and SE, then all reading comp, then you review the ones that you have marked. Remember, as you take the exam, you have this option to mark for review any that you want to go back to at the end. What this does is it basically means if you do fall behind because of a slower reading passage, you are not impacting as much of the section. And yeah, I see one question in the chat that says, what about the 3 blanks? I use the 3 blanks for the last and solve RC, SE, and TC first. I think that's fine too. The 3 blanks being a subcategory of text completion. If those for you are the particular bugaboo, the particularly hardest ones, saving those for the end I think works too. By the same logic. If you save them for the end, basically what you're saying is I struggle with these. I'm statistically less likely to get these to begin with. And so I'm going to save them for the end so that they don't steal any time from other friendlier problems. I think that's a great logic that many people use when thinking through their timing strategies. But whatever timing you want to do, I would just say to rehearse it. So in practice exams, try this out and see how it's working for you. Don't go in and try a totally new timing strategy on test day. So whatever timing you want to do, rehearse and iterate so that you're basically confident in what you want to do on test day. Section 2, just to show this on the screen quickly, it's similar, same format, TC, then a little bit of RC, then sentence equivalents, then more RC. Same 1, 2, 3, 4 here. It's just each section is a little bit longer. And this really does help to just knowing this will help you so that the test is less of a surprise, and you can also use it to empower you to take the test, take the section in whatever order you choose. So that's the end of what I've got here tonight. If you want to study more with us in Manhattan Prep, a couple things you can do. We do have free trial classes. So any of our online classes, you can take the first session for free. If you go to our website, you'll find the ability to register for one of those. Also, keep watching this series. There's 2 more sessions like this. One of them is going to be a similar session talking about how to get over the score hump for quant into the 160s. And you can also go to our website and get a free starter kit. So this includes more resources than what I've mentioned here. You can get, for example, a free, a sample review log, I believe, to go in there and actually a spreadsheet where you can write your notes of the type that I was talking about today during the session when reviewing reading comp. So, all right, I hope these tips have helped. from a big picture, this is what I would work on if you're trying to get over that final, if your verbal score feels stuck and you're trying to raise it further, I would focus on vocabulary, get into learning those words, make your own flashcards, revisit them often. It will really help bail you out because, as one of the comments said, if you don't know the word, a problem can be impossible. If you know the word, suddenly it can feel easy. Secondarily, and especially on reading comp, whenever you do make a mistake, especially when you miss one of those times that you were choosing between two different answers, do a really deep, thorough review of why did I pick wrong? What was the evidence that I missed for the right answer? And what was the trap that I fell for in the wrong answer? I think you can see quite a lot of improvement through that review process. And it's a way to level up in verbal. That's a little different from quant, where you're mainly leveling up by practicing something a lot of times. This is less about how many verbal questions did you do, and it's more about how deep and helpful was your review process on each one you did. Well, thanks for being here today. This is my last session of the series. It's been nice to get a few sessions with you all during this 12-part series. Again, on the GRE Prep YouTube channel, you can find the videos, and within each video, you can find links to the other episodes of the series. Thanks for being here, and I hope you're back for my colleagues' presentations the next couple weeks. Bye-bye.